could she be? Gotta find her. Got no choice.
Where, what a wuss. Hey, wanna race? Parker hates it when I get the drop on him.
I hate it when he gets the drop on me.
And now we move on to the discussion portion of this issue, making its triumphant return for the first time since issue number 9. In order to properly tackle the place that Spider-Man occupies in the legacy of both the character's game library and superhero video games overall, I've enlisted 3 very special guests to join me. First up, he's the webmaster of ComicGamersAssemble.com, has one of the most impressive collections of comics-based video games that I've ever seen, and is using his vast knowledge of his favorite character to create a book about Spidey's forays into the video game medium due out soon, Mr. BLAIR FARRELL. Blair, how you doing?
Very good. Nice lazy Sunday, playing some Dreamcast, rocking my Insomniac Spider-Man shirt, and ready to talk about some Spider-Man.
Awesome. Sounds perfect. Next, he's the creator of the incredible YouTube channel Panels to Pixels, creating his own very impressive commentaries on both the history and the future of comics-based gaming, Mr. JOSH SUTTON. Josh, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be amongst my esteemed comic gamer colleagues.
It's wonderful. Thank you, sir. And finally, the creator of Superhero.VG, his own wonderful YouTube channel, a former employee of Marvel Games who worked on 5 modern Spider-Man video games, as well as the author of the wonderful book, Wrong! Retro Games You Messed Up Our Comic Book Heroes. Mr. Chris Baker joins us to talk about Spider-Man 2000. Chris, thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you for saying the name of my book in a very meaningful, well-articulated way. It's a very long title. It doesn't need to be that long. But no, seriously, it's great to be here. I've been a fan of this podcast since before I knew you. I've been a fan of Josh's channel since before I knew him. I don't know how much Blair knows how his website actually helped me write that book at times. So, I've been a fan of all you guys, and now you're like 3 of my best internet friends, and that's great.
No, it's true, man. I mean, it's great that I feel like Blair, like he said before, is the Nick Fury of the group, because we all maintain an online chat. We talk to each other all the time about comics-based video games. I think it's one of our favorite topics. And it's just a lot of fun. So I'm really glad that we can all come together for a pretty momentous video game, if I do say so myself. So I figured that a good place to start the discussion would be where this game stands in the larger pantheon of Spidey games for you guys personally. Now, hopefully people who listen to Comics on Consoles are familiar with the work that you gentlemen do in the realm of comics-based gaming, but for the stragglers that may not be, start by giving me an idea of what Spider-Man as a character means to you, why his representation in video games is important to you, and where you think Spidey 2000 sits in the character's interactive legacy. Josh, why don't you kick us off?
Spider-Man, it feels like a character who was always around in my life, particularly in gaming. I think one of the first games I ever played would have been Spider-Man versus the Kingpin on the Sega Mega Drive. And that might have even been my first ever encounter with the character. But, in terms of what he means to me, I liked a lot of things, a lot of dumb things when I was a child. And Spider-Man is one of only a handful of things that I'm still talking about in my late 20s. So I think there's got to be a reason behind that. And part of that is his legacy in gaming as well as comics. And just the fact that character has endured as he has for, what has it been now? 50, 60 years or in comics.
We're closer to 60 than we are to 50 now.
I think he just turned 56 this past month. In August, it was 56, yes.
So, I mean, that's what he means to me in terms of... Sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
No. It's all right. What about the Spidey 2000 game as far
Oh
as
yeah,
the overall legacy?
of course, yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's so much to say about the legacy of that game and its influence on kind of modern games. It was kind of the first of the modern games. You can really draw a line between that and things that the previous Spider-Man games, things like Maximum Carnage and even the dreaded Web of Fire on the 32X and things like that. So it really
Not if you own it. It's worth a lot of
Yeah.
money. For those who know what that means.
So that's where its legacy is. It's the Sergeant Peppers of video games. It kind of everything changed after that point. I say that looking up at a humongous Sergeant Peppers poster above my desk, so that's why it popped into my head. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure we're going to elaborate more on this as the discussion goes along. But that's where it stands in terms of its legacy for me.
Perfect. That's a wonderful perspective. Blair, how about you?
Well, Spider-Man, I mean, God, it's so crazy to think about. My earliest memories, like a lot of people, maybe is the '60s cartoon. We have a local channel called NTV, and it used to play the reruns all the time. And that was really my first introduction. I remember my nan bought me a pair of Spider-Man pajamas, and it was like the costume with a tiny little hood. And I looked forward to bedtime, which is a weird thing as a kid because I just wanted to put on my Spider-Man costume and play Spider-Man before like I went to sleep. And why it's kind of stuck with me over the years, as I kind of bring up in my book, I grew up in a really small town, and in the '90s where things like comics and video games didn't make you the most popular kid in a town, where people just like going in the woods and driving around in their ATVs and stuff. So I really related to the story about this kid who, he had trouble making friends and fitting in, and then he got to escape in this role of Spider-Man, and that's how I kind of escaped into Spider-Man comics, whether that's video games or cartoons, which was a big thing for me, more so than any of the comics, as they were hard to come by. I think his representation of video games has been important because he is such an important character, and I'm seeing so many people now where it's such an insane pressure on the people making these games. I can only imagine everyone's been pretty positive towards Insomniac, except if you're reading some crazy people over the last couple of weeks. But I can only imagine the pressure that anyone has to take when they're taking on this license. As we've established, when your 60-year-old character is beloved by millions around the world. As to where this would fall in my kind of favorite Spider-Man games, it's definitely always, it ships around the top 5. It's around this and Spider-Man 2, Ultimate Spider-Man, Shattered Dimensions, and Maximum Carnage. It's always those 5 until Friday, of course, which I'm sure that's going to change, but I'm sure it will still even be in there after then.
Sure. Very understandable. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, obviously I'm a huge fan of Spider-Man. And I grew up, I'm older than you guys, I'm in my 40s. And I grew up, my first experience with Spider-Man was probably Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends in the early 80s on NBC every Saturday morning. So I grew up thinking that Spider-Man lived in an apartment where he had like a secret, like, spider computer kind of thing, where I think they pulled a trophy and like the apartment transformed into like a superhero hideout and all that, and hung out with Firestar, and Iceman. And back then, like, there's actually a picture of me. I think I'm 3 years old and I'm wearing a Spider-Man t-shirt. I probably was not involved in that purchase decision, but my parents knew early on, I guess, my taste. But I was always a fan of the character, but I wasn't really a fan of the character until probably the 90s, when the cartoon came out. even though I was borderline too old to be watching Saturday morning cartoons at that point. Uh, and,
You're among friends. Don't worry about it.
Well, yeah. You guys were still kids though at that point. I was in my mid-teens at least. And then, also the Maximum Carnage game was actually played a big role because I really enjoyed that game. It familiarized me with not only more into Spider-Man and Venom, but Carnage too, of course, but like just really weird stuff like Shriek and I never heard of Iron Fist before he was in that game. So that was a kind of a breakthrough moment there too. But I think the thing about the character that I really like is that I think more so than any comic book character, at the end of the day, he's the most like me. Peter is, definitely the geek. A million people have said this kind of thing, but he was definitely a geek in high school and all that. But he also has like a sense of humor to him. Tries to take things in stride, no matter how tough things get. And I like to think that's kind of how I live my life. So I can't walk on walls, but I definitely have sort of a Peter Parker thing going on.
Sure.
But yeah, so then in 2000 is when this game came out. And I think it just played a huge role, not only in like the way people looked at Spider-Man as a video game character, but in the way that people looked at superheroes as video game characters. There were certainly some good superhero games before that, but I think this is certainly the first 3D superhero game that really kind of was something that just a regular gamer who wasn't necessarily a fan of comic books or whatever could get a lot out of. And if you were a comic book fan, all the more, like I actually like to think of it kind of as as fitting in the universe of the 90s cartoon. It doesn't exactly, but it actually kind of does. It could have been like a lost episode of that.
Sure.
So, and just, there's a lot of games that came out with superheroes like on the PlayStation. But it was not until this game came out near the end of the PlayStation's life cycle that we actually had a good one, outside of the Marvel versus Capcom, fighting games that had come out. But those are fighting games. It's a whole other kind of thing. So, I think the impact that this game had is obviously huge, and it only got bigger. Spider-Man only got bigger as the games went on. It's still one of my favorite games for sure. Starring the
Great.
Color.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great perspective. Well, let's talk about those early days of 3D gaming because, and as I expounded on in the main part of the issue, to me, Spider-Man is an important title in the context of ultimately getting superheroes in 3 dimensions just in general right for the future. So as a 3D game, do you think trying to kind of divorce it from the superhero genre, just focusing on where it stands as a 3D action game, do you guys think that Spider-Man was a standout for its time or not so much when compared to like the Tomb Raiders that would come along? And by that same token, how well do you think it holds up now as a 3D game? Blair, what do you think?
I think it holds up, and it was good for the time. The big problem that would be corrected around the movie game was that there is no camera control to speak of, which is really obnoxious, especially in certain fights. Every fight with Venom, the one in the alley and the one in the sewer, you just can't see where he's to, and he'll just kind of jump up behind you, which is actually kind of cool because it's indicative of how he doesn't trigger your spider sense, so he would be able to sneak up on you, but it's still really annoying. But yeah, I mean, I played Spider-Man last week. I periodically throw it on. I own it on 3 different consoles. Last week was the N64 game, and it's still really fun to play. And if you just play on easy, it's just so much fun just to breeze through. It's pretty casual, hour and a half to get through, even shorter maybe. And it's still fun to play. And I think with the panel we have, we kind of grew up with 3D games a little. So I can see maybe people younger having trouble going back to it, but we kind of had the growing pains of 3D games where we were playing stuff like Tomb Raider, like Chris mentioned, where everything was in like weird grids. And for me, I love a game called Mega Man Legends, where you have to constantly keep adjusting the camera with a trigger button. So even like Capcom productions still weren't locking down 3D. So it's a little bit clunky, but I mean, I was kind of thinking about this, and it's weird to think in the terms of another game being like Superman 64, where like you had Neversoft and you had Titus, and they had to figure out how to make these characters work in 3D, and one was a huge success and the other was Superman 64. But how to make like a 3D game where I don't think I had played a game where you can climb on walls and swing and kind of hover above enemies and making levels that take advantage of that. It was really incredible, especially when you were kind of they were all learning for the first time how to do that. And it's really astounding what they managed to do.
Yeah, definitely. Chris, what do you think about that? Its current status and its status at the time and as a 3D title.
Yeah. Well, okay. Current. What do you mean by current status exactly? Like,
well, just how it holds up.
Yeah. Well, I haven't played it in a long time, so I'm not going to answer that. But I imagine as much as a game that is that old does hold up, it probably is up there. Like Blair mentioned, the one thing I definitely remember being its biggest weakness was the camera. I think I haven't listened to your actual podcast about the game yet, Chris, but I'm sure you cover that it's done by Neversoft, who is doing Tony Hawk, and it's from the Tony Hawk engine. So, I don't know like how much that has to do with both the good things they pulled off and the parts where it wasn't so great in terms of camera. Okay, and yeah, as a 3D game, it's interesting because I actually think this is probably the last great game on the PlayStation 1, because this was about 2 months before the PS2 came out. There may have been some other like really good games on PS1, but for the most part, all the attention was going to the PS2 from here on out. Spider-Man doesn't get like mentioned in the same breath as say like Metal Gear Solid or Tomb Raider or something like that. And, maybe it doesn't quite deserve to be there, but it's close. I think it's really close. And, it's a game that just, it stands out on its own as just being fun to play for its time, and looking really nice and just respecting the character, more than any Spider-Man game especially had. That's for sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
As much as I like Maximum Carnage, like Spider-Man just doesn't go down on the street and just beat up random punks and move along and beat up more random punks and move along, which is pretty much all that game is. Even Sega's arcade game was that exact same thing, right? Like,
I'm still waiting for a Spider-Man comic where a female henchman comes up and whips him with her hair. Still waiting on that.
Yes. I think probably the closest that we had gotten to like respecting the character to its max at that point was the Sega console game, the one we mentioned earlier that was on Genesis, and then the Sega CD game was like an enhanced version of that. But still you had things like Spider-Man punching cops a lot of the time. Like cops were like, if you lost it, you needed to continue the game. The animation was Spider-Man in jail punching a cop to get out of jail.
Oh, it's hilarious.
Yeah. So you don't have any of that in this game. It respects the character immensely. Pretty much, from what I can recall, like most of the characters were on point in terms of what they can do. Their kind of threat level was great. The ending of the game is fantastic when Carnage and the Carnage symbiote and Dr. Octopus combine. Like that kind of blew me away. Like that was a huge fan moment. And now actually in comics recently we have Green Goblin combining with the Carnage symbiote to become the Red Goblin. So in some ways, it was doing that, almost 20 years before the actual comics were doing it. So it was really creative in that regard as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Josh, what do you think as far as where it stands as an early 3D game and if it still holds up?
Yeah, I mean, it's at the tail end of the PS1 thing life cycle, and I think as the other guys alluded to, I think the reason that it maybe isn't as revered to younger or more in the contemporary gamer sphere now is because it doesn't necessarily hold up as well as something like Spider-Man 2. But having said that, like thinking about it at the time, I was thinking before, about the camera. The camera, the lack of camera is a problem. But you compare it to something like the GTA series 3 and Vice City, which those are next gen games. They were kind of a few years after this, and they also didn't have a movable camera. And those games, they're the games that kind of made the PS2, or they're part of the reason the PS2 became the biggest selling console at the time. So, I mean, comparing it to other 3D action games of the time, this is 4 years after the likes of Crash Bandicoot or Tomb Raider, and I do think it makes some improvements on those things. And the game I would kind of compare it to is Tenchu, or that series anyway. It kind of feels more in line with that because it isn't a platformer, really. It's and yeah, I think it holds up. I don't know. It's difficult to say, and I think Blair said this as well. Going back to it now, we grew up with that game, and so I played it a bit today to try and refresh my memory, and it feels comfortable. Nothing about it feels odd. It feels really responsive. I particularly took notice of the jump. The jump feels really good. It's a good height. It's not extreme, and it feels responsive and springy. Miles above Tomb Raider, which was an earlier game which had problems with things like that. So I think it does, and I think at the end of the day, I think it's more the visuals that is the reason that it doesn't hold up than anything. As with that first generation of 3D games, they lack the kind of retro coolness of the 16-bit thing, which is kind of became in vogue with indie games, kind of basing themselves on that style, and it lacks the kind of realism that kind of came towards the end of the PS2 era. So I think. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and again, this is the dawn of cinematics in a way. Metal Gear Solid was kind of a big breakthrough in that, and so yeah, I think it's more the visuals that don't hold up than anything. But I think people who grew up with it can look past that, really.
Even still to that end. Sorry, Josh. Even to that end, like there is a full. I saw a full 3D character. I can't talk. A full 3D character model viewer in the game. So as much as we may look back at that now and think that it's not really that impressive, at the time it was. At the time it was like not only do we think this looks good, we think it looks so good that you're going to want to take the model and spin it around. I can't remember if you could zoom in on it or not, but pretty much any character model that existed in the game, you could do that with.
Yeah, that's true. I think one of the things too, and I mentioned it in the episode proper, is that it's hard to predict exactly how people are going to view a game like this, like let's say in a generation, right? Because it's not going to be too long before a kid's born who ends up growing up loving Spider-Man, who looks back on the character's gaming history and might look at this game the way that I look at the Atari 2600 game, as someone who wasn't around when the 2600 was on the market and didn't really come into gaming generally until, I started in the 8-bit era, but I got hardcore into it in the 16-bit era. It's hard to see how it's going to be taken, but at the same time, it has a clearly illustrated narrative from beginning to end with full voice acting and the cinematics that, may not look great in comparison today, but they're still eminently watchable and I think entertaining. So it's hard for me to try and predict into the future exactly how it's going to hold up for a future generation, just because, you know, the technology is going to get completely superannuated by, well, I mean, it kind of already is, but it will be even further so when we get into future hardware generations, if they exist. You know, there's the whole this are consoles going to exist in the future? But no, I think those are all very, very valid perspectives, because I mean, that's one of the things that I try and push forward in this show, is that it's the grandfather of certainly the superhero games that we appreciate today. But I also do think that it has a pretty important place in the larger zeitgeist of 3D gaming. But
I think you could. Oh, sorry, Chris.
no, please.
I was just going to say, I think you could probably. I think now even is we're at a point where if you're 10 years old, you know, you're born in 2008. This is 8 years before that, which is, you know, almost half your life ago. Almost double your life ago. There was this game that came out, and, you know, if you're 10 right now, do you care about that game that came out in 2000? Probably not. I think you might actually, if you're really interested in the medium of video games and you're really interested in the character of Spider-Man, I think that's the kind of thing when you mature a bit, maybe you're 15, 18, then you go back and look and you start to discover this kind of stuff, kind of like, you know, you might discover a movie that came out 10 years before you're born, or like, you know, I found comics from the 60s and 70s really hard to read for a really long time. And in some ways they still are. But, you know, I'm certainly very interested to know what happened and, you know, just the kind of way they looked and, you know, the characters being introduced and that sort of thing. So I certainly haven't read every issue of Amazing Spider-Man from the 60s, but I have gone back and I've looked over the highlights. And it's part of my just kind of getting to know the general kind of zeitgeist of the character, I guess. And I think like this kind of thing fits into that.
Oh, sure. And, you know, I think that especially with these games, if you do become interested in the histories of the characters at large, these kinds of other media efforts can be snapshots of where the character was viewed at this point in history. The thing that always comes up for me, you know, I live outside Chicago right now, so I'm not too far from Six Flags Great America, where they have a roller coaster called Superman Ultimate Flight. And when you're walking in the line queue to get on the actual coaster, there are billboards set up at the length of the line queue that have biographies for a bunch of different Superman supporting characters, along with images of how they looked in 90s comics. So the Supergirl that's there is the Matrix Supergirl, who isn't actually Kryptonian. She's an alien shapeshifter. And Superboy has the fade haircut. And Superman looks very Dan Jurgens-y, and you know, it's got older designs for the villains and those things like that.
Does he have the mullet?
He doesn't have. No, he does. Yeah, he does have the mullet. Yeah,
nice.
He does. And it's like, that's really interesting, because that was the era of Superman comics that the mainstream was obsessed with for a little while after the death of Superman. Right. And it's just one of those things where you can look and see how people at large viewed these characters in the context of that time. And I think video games are absolutely a part of that too. It seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know if you guys were picking up like Ultimate Spider-Man when it first started coming out, but it seemed like around 2000 or so, there was the sort of tone of those early Lee Ditko, Romita Spider-Man stories kind of became popular again, because that's what it seems like this game tries to push forward tonally in its story. Do you think that's accurate?
I think this game hit at like a really strong time, because I think of twice in my lifetime around Spider-Man comics. It was around 95 to 2000 where the character of Spider-Man was a bit of a pariah. Like, I remember reading, that's when I got into comics, and everything I was reading was DC, because it was around Marvel's bankruptcy period. I remember there were so many jokes in Wizard magazine where Spider-Man would just look like a hobo with like a brown paper bag liquor bottle in his hand.
Oh, geez.
And it was just like always poking fun because it was Marvel's bankruptcy period where everything was. I mean, I didn't read a lot of Marvel comics, but I remember seeing them in stores and they looked really cheap. And I there was never really any hype for them. But then 2000, it was kind of like this whirlwind of here's Ultimate Spider-Man, here's this new video game. It's the first 3D Spider-Man game ever. And then there's like the movie was hitting, so it was all of these Spider-Man things, and it kind of hit at the perfect time. So that's why like this game kind of fits in that kind of
Sure.
yeah. Okay, and like it was like that, and like around the One More Day era where there was like after Spider-Man 3, and there was also that time when
Ooh,
Spider-Man kind of like fell off, but then came back as he always does. Like, I don't think Spider-Man will ever be unpopular for a long time, but there has been eras that have been, well, less regarded than others.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Chris, you were a member of the gaming press at the time that this game came out, working for the official PlayStation magazine. Is that right?
That is correct. Official U.S. PlayStation magazine. If you want
Right.
to get the whole OPM is what everyone called us.
Sure. So
Yeah.
if you could, go back for us and paint a picture of the climate of gaming from your perspective at the time, because I'm sure that working in that office gave you some pretty decent access to what the general zeitgeist of the video gaming world was, especially in an era before comic book games were really paid much attention to compared with today. So with that, what did the arrival of Spider-Man bring to the table for the games of the time and for you personally? And what was it like getting the chance to actually review it for OPM?
Yeah. You know, I mentioned earlier that there really weren't any good superhero games at all on PlayStation up to that point, which was very near the end of the life cycle. And, you know, when this game came out, our magazine was already like gearing up for the PS2 launch. Like that was why people were buying our magazine more so, I think, than the reviews of PS1 games at the time. We're also in a period where we talked about Superman on Nintendo 64 earlier. That was a year before this. They actually canceled that game on PlayStation because it was, I think, because it was so poorly received.
Right.
So like that was the last kind of real superhero video game launch, and it didn't go over well, even in the purely PlayStation kind of perspective. Everyone knew about that game and how bad it was. So, we were, and just in general, this was an era of movie games coming out for pretty much any action movie, all kinds of licensed stuff, and it usually wasn't very good. It had the superhero games were terrible, licensed games were generally not good, so it had kind of all the odds against it. So it was actually pretty easily dismissed if you weren't a fan of the character, which I was getting into my being a hardcore fan of the character. That probably came most around when the movie came out, but I was definitely more of a fan than like pre Maximum Carnage and pre the TV show and everything. But around this time, it really actually made me super excited. I first saw it before I started working for that magazine it was on the cover of Electronic Gaming Monthly about a year before, which was in the same building as OPM. And so I would eventually know those guys who wrote that story. But yeah, so it was like people were kind of impressed with the way that it looked and everything, because it actually was a very good looking game. Just the kind of comic book aesthetic really came through, and I think that really worked for it. Worked really well on the PlayStation, where the graphics were a lot simpler than we're used to now.
Sure.
But you had all these bright costumes and comic book environments and that sort of thing that kind of really made it shine through so to impress people. And so people were, they, as the kind of information came out and the screenshots came out, like everyone was sort of getting a positive view of it. But people like me who were really into comics were getting super invested, and I was really happy with the way it turned out. I gave it a 5 out of 5 in my review. Most reviews were somewhere like in the 80%. So I was higher than most, probably because I'm a fan, but I don't regret it. It's one of the few 5 out of 5s I gave, and I do think it is still one of the most important superhero games. I think probably Arkham Asylum is the most important superhero game, but this is certainly for its time was the most important superhero game.
It's funny that you bring up Arkham Asylum, because it seems like, at least with what you're describing, both Arkham Asylum and Spider-Man had kind of similar trajectories. I mean, maybe Spider-Man didn't make as much of a big splash as Arkham Asylum did comparatively, but they both seem to, at least from what you're describing, come in kind of under the radar, but people thought that they looked kind of cool. And then when they actually came out,
I think Arkham probably came in more under the radar because it had been so long. Actually, Batman's game history is better than Spider-Man's before that, but it had been a really long time before like a really good Batman game had come out.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing in the 2000s. I mean, Vengeance was okay, I guess, but there was nothing really remarkable in the 2000s for Batman. And so that one definitely kind of was just this Batman game that IDOS was putting out back then. People forget that part too.
Right. Sure.
Yeah.
But Spider-Man in 2000, I do think told the world that a 3D superhero game can be good at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway. So kind of the same question then for Josh and Blair. Take us back to the time you first got to play Spider-Man. Were you aware or excited about it before it came out? And what did you guys feel when you actually got the controller in your hands and played it for the first time? Josh?
Yeah, well, I said to you guys earlier before we were on air that the first time I would have even seen this game would have been on the front cover of official UK PlayStation magazine. And I'm trying to think, like, had I seen even a 3D rendering of Spider-Man up to the point? I think there were some commercials for the toys and things like that, and occasionally you'd get like a really dodgy 3D rendering in the animated series. But up to that point, it was, I think, the only time I'd ever seen a 3D Spider-Man would be someone dressed up, or even like the Nicholas Hammond TV series and things like that. And It was really striking to me seeing this character that I was so used to seeing in pen and ink, kind of leaping off the front cover of this magazine to me. And that magazine, I think that must have come out a month before the game's release, and it had a demo, which was the first level, kind of going towards the bank heist. And I was it's just from playing that demo, it was one of my favorite games of my childhood. But I just want to also, because we've said how groundbreaking this is as a 3D superhero game, and I know we also alluded to the Marvel vs. Capcom series, but also I want to kind of pay lip service to X-Men Mutant Academy. Which,
yeah, it's a terrific game. I love that game.
Yeah, and obviously it's a fighting game, so it's limited in the kind of scope of what it could do and how much it could really turn the genre on its head, really. But I think those two games and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 all came out in September in Europe, anyway. It was all within a month of each other, and those three games are really my fondest memories of the PlayStation 1. And in terms of like them being at the tail end of the PS1's life, I think that you can also make an argument that that's when a lot of innovation happens, is at the end of a console's life cycle. And I think that I cannot overstate how I think it's difficult for people now really to appreciate how this is pre-films or anything, how crazy it was to see 3D comic book characters. It was quite mind-blowing at the time. Just going off the back of what you're saying about the Arkham thing, I think that this really can be seen to be the Arkham of its day. And I think that the reason that they both succeed in that way, especially Arkham Asylum, I think there's a lot of parallels, is because they, as you were saying, it's a time capsule of how the character was perceived at that time. And also I think it succeeds in taking the best elements from it cherry picks the best elements from every adaptation of that character. So in the same way that the Arkham series took the DC animated universe and kind of took some of the voice actors, but paired it with this kind of like gritty realism of the Nolan films. Spider-Man 2000, does the same. You've got voice actors from Spider-Man Unlimited and the animated series, and as you said, I think the fact that this came off the back of Spider-Man's dark days of the Clone Saga and things like that, and the kind of the speculator bubble bursting, you get a distillation of the character that was very much influenced by the animated series, and the animated series itself succeeds by simplifying that and saying, everything has got so bloated and convoluted in the comics. Let's take it back to Liam Ditko or Liam Romita. And I think that's where the success of this game lies, in the same way that Batman Arkham Asylum said, let's take what works about this character and throw out everything else that doesn't.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very valid perspective, and one that I completely agree with. Blair, how about you? How aware or excited were you before the game came out, and what did you feel when you got to actually play it for the first time?
I don't actually remember seeing a lot of it. I only had a Nintendo 64 until actually Christmas of 2000. So I was reading Nintendo Power, and I don't remember getting a lot of coverage. I didn't remember, it wasn't really on my radar. The Christmas before in 1999, my brother got a PlayStation, but he was in university, so he would only be home for Christmas and the summer. But that Christmas, getting my teeth into a PlayStation, I was like, oh my god, I can't believe what I've been missing. I played like Metal Gear Solid and Resident Evil 3, and I couldn't wait to get back. And it was around that time when I started getting into other consoles. I became disenfranchised a little bit with Nintendo because I had the N64 for so long. The first time I remember seeing it was commercials during the Electric Playground. I think Chris did a video about Spider-Man commercials, and you can find it in there. Chris Baker, rather, because I know there's two. And it was, the commercial was like, you don't play it, you live it, and it looked so cool. And I was around that time, actually. The PlayStation 1 came out, the ONE. There was a PlayStation that was the size of like a sandwich container. And a bunch of people I knew, they suddenly got a PlayStation 1 because it was super cheap, and they all bought Spider-Man because I guess everyone was a huge Tony Hawk fan. And in the commercials, the last line is from the creators of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, so I guess that was the big push. And everyone was talking about it, like, oh man, there's this game, you can do all this stuff, and I was really jealous of them. And then in October of that year, I went to go visit my brother in Ottawa, where he was in university, and he went to a Blockbuster and rented it, and we sat down and played it. And it was like so crazy, as I was getting to experience all of this hype that people were talking about this game and how much fun it was. And it was such a cherished memory of mine. And then I renting out the N64 version when it came out in November, being so disappointed because all the presentation is sucked out, like all the cutscenes are gone. And even as I totally forgot until last week when I replayed the N64 game, it doesn't have the awesome remix of the theme song during the credits, which is one of my favorite parts of that game.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, it has some short character models, but yeah, that was, and that year, I remember like Chris talking about it, that year was a big year for the PlayStation. It wasn't, they had that redesign, and then a lot of people couldn't afford the PlayStation 2. I think it was $600 in Canada where I lived. And that year was such a big year. You still had Spider-Man came out in September. I think X-Men was during the summer. Final Fantasy 9 came out. Dino Crisis 2, Mega Man Legends 2. There was like still a lot of life in the PlayStation, and the PlayStation 2 was a new the next thing with DVDs, but I think there was a lot of life in the PlayStation to have something like this was, a treat towards the end of that console life cycle, and something was a lot easier to play when I eventually got my own PlayStation later that year.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome. That's a cool story. Well, let's move on a little bit to some of the actual game content, because we've talked so far about 3D games and how managing the 3D space was pretty solid, especially for the time that it came out. But what about how it represents particularly the source material? So what do you guys feel that the game gets right and wrong? Get this little, yeah. All right. Moving
I don't
on.
think anyone listening other than me appreciates that. But
That's all right. That was for you anyway. But what do you guys feel that the game gets right and wrong about representing Spider-Man, just in general? Blair, what about you? Do you think that there's anything? Why don't you start off with what you think it maybe gets wrong, if anything? Maybe you don't think it gets anything wrong.
It's tough to say. I can't really think of anything out top of my head. The only thing I really I kind of don't like is Carnage working, I guess, with Dr. Octopus.
Oh, okay, yeah, sure.
Because I don't think Carnage is the type of person who would team up with someone, especially like that. But in that, it actually has a huge positive of mine, and it's what I really think the game does right is how well it handles the source material. Like it handles the mechanics of web slinging as simple as it was and sticking to walls, but what goes underappreciated is just exactly how much you learn about Spider-Man if this was your first ever Spider-Man, if this was your introduction to the character, even as early as level 2. It's something that's divorced from the plot, but you have Peter Parker calls J. Jonah Jameson about the technology heist at the start of the game, and he's being attacked by the Scorpion. And the Scorpion has nothing to do with the rest of it. You race to the Daily Bugle, you beat the Scorpion, but you have the established relationship with J. Jonah Jameson not trusting Spider-Man, a short introduction of the Scorpion, and Peter Parker's job. And my favorite part is actually in the middle of the game at the start of the Venom section, because you have these two things are happening simultaneously. Venom is on the New York Jumbotron. Actually, that's something that's wrong. How did Venom broadcast on the New York Jumbotron? How did, I guess Eddie broadcast
take it over.
a journalism degree.
He murdered like 50 people to get into the control room for that thing.
Yeah.
That's the dark story you don't hear.
But that part, because Venom has his wife, but then Rhino is going to do a heist at a place called Omnitech. And Spider-Man, his origin is he turned the other, he let this bad thing happen, then now he's making up for it. And at that point, he says, life is giving me a lot, life is taking a lot away. I'm paraphrasing, but there's people in Omnitech and they're in trouble, so we have to deal with them. So he's going to deal with the greater good as opposed to his own personal good. And that's Spider-Man in a nutshell, and just that one part. And going back, I guess, to the Doc Ock thing, it's kind of like the Carnage boss fight at the end, because there's a big sonic bubble that you have to knock Carnage into, and you're like, why would there be this thing here? But when you think of Dr. Octopus and how he's this huge master planner, that he would have a contingency for Carnage turning on him, and then he had a tool to take care of him. And like that and the Venom part they just get Spider-Man so right. And just the writing and the voice acting, like I think Rina Romano is such an underappreciated Spider-Man who only got to do this game, its sequel, and Spider-Man Unlimited, which I actually enjoy Spider-Man Unlimited for what it is, mostly for his delivery. But yeah, it more so, even with all the mechanics, it got that right, but then it also got what made him last for so long, and why we're still talking about him and excited about a game that's coming out Friday. That's more probably something that I've learned more about this game more so than how it handles everything mechanically.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And it's good that you mentioned Reno Romano, because I agree with you. And since I played this game a little bit later than you guys did, because I didn't play it when it first came out, I first knew Reno Romano from he had a voice role in a really good Star Trek first person shooter that I loved when I was a kid. And then of course he also got to play Batman
That's
in
what I thought you were going to bring up.
a pretty decent animated series, all things considered.
It
It's
got a
just
lot better
It
as
got
it went
good.
around.
It started off pretty terrible. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, especially, I love the way that it brought Robin in, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, that's
I'm
a
sure
whole other
that's a whole other thing. Chris, what do you think the game gets right and wrong about representing Spider-Man? This is kind of in your general wheelhouse. So.
Absolutely. And I think there's actually a pretty huge reason it gets so much right. And that is that one of the producers behind the game, who I believe was the man behind the story, is a guy named TQ Jefferson. He showed me the game when I was at OPM in 2000, and he was super excited about it. He pointed things out like, the villains we have here are pretty much the really early Spider-Man villains, because we're kind of treating it like an early Spider-Man game.
Mhm.
And actually, you know what? No, strike that. That was for the movie game. I'm wrong. Because he showed me that too. I'm getting my games mixed up here. But one of the things he told me, I remember when he showed us the game, was in the second level. It's like a stealth mission or whatever, and he pointed out the phrase I'll never forget: "Evil never looks up," which is why you were able to get everybody pretty easily. But the cool thing too about TQ Jefferson is that 8 years later, he became my boss at Marvel Games. So the guy really knew his stuff. He was VP of Games from 2008 to 2014. We worked on a ton of stuff together, and it makes a lot of sense to me that everything feels so Marvel, because this guy is one of the biggest Marvel fans I've ever met. So in terms of things getting wrong, it's like super picky stuff that you have to do for a video game, right? Like, Spider-Man in any video game, he can knock anybody out in one punch, but that's not fun.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
So it's like the gamey kind of stuff, I think, there's no real goblin presence either in this or the sequel, which I think is
there's a secret
weird.
in the police chase.
Yeah.
And that's about it.
Yeah, that's it. There's no, Green Goblin, I think had just come back from the dead around this time in the comics. But Hobgoblin was like the main goblin at that point for a good 15 years or so. And I'm kind of surprised that he never made it in there. So that's not wrong. That's just like I would think this would be there.
Yeah, sure.
But the kind of story that they told, it's a really good Spider-Man story, and it ends in a really compelling way, and I think that's great. I also love the Marvel cameos.
Yeah.
I don't think there had been a game in either Marvel or DC that was did such a good job of incorporating them. Like there's a moment with the Punisher throughout the course of the game, I remember. And then of course, that I can't remember if he meets Daredevil in the middle of it or if it's just at the end, but Captain America gets involved. At the end, they have a game of Go Fish,
Right.
which is, it's one of my favorite game endings ever, because it's ridiculous, but it's fun to watch. It's super fun.
Daredevil, why you're always looking at my cards.
But the idea that Frank Castle would be invited to the same gaming table as Captain America is kind of funny. But yeah, that endears me to it as well. I like it a lot.
Yeah, it's just super fun, which at the end of the day, I think is what Spider-Man is just, he represents the fun of comic books.
Yeah, no, very well said. Absolutely. I mean, if any character can actually get that across, yeah, Spider-Man is probably kind of the poster child for that. Josh, how about you? What do you think the game, just from your own personal perspective on Spider-Man, gets right and wrong about him?
I mean, in terms of what it gets wrong, again, there's only nitpicky stuff. Actually, Blair brought up the Carnage boss battle, and that's I would say that's probably the weakest boss battle in the game, but it's also the penultimate one, so that part always feels a bit anticlimactic to me. It kind of ruins the flow just before you go into.
Actually, can I point something out there? You do need to kill him with sound, right?
Yeah, it's a sonic bubble.
Yeah, isn't that part
of it? It's a sonic bubble.
Yeah, because up to this point in games, if you fought Carnage, you just beat the crap out of him and that was it.
Right.
So they took the effort to. It's a very important part of defeating Carnage is you either beat him with fire or sound. So they had sound in this case, and I think that's the first time. I think every other time you fought Carnage, which was a fair number of times in the 90s, you just punched him until he went down, and that's just not how you beat Carnage.
Sure, yeah. That's a fair point.
So you're wrong, Josh.
I'm not saying. I'm saying in terms of level design, though, it's in a small circular room. It feels like it's in the office of Doc Ock's building or whatever the facility is, and it feels like everything gets scaled back a lot for that, and it's just a bit of a fiddly stage, and the voice for Carnage isn't particularly good. It's kind of screechy and kind of annoying. Anyway, that's a small nitpick. The in terms of translating a comic to a game, it suffers from the same pitfalls that a lot of games do, which is that you can't just, although it does do this to a certain extent, you can't just go from boss to boss, and so you need underlings, you need cannon fodder, and I feel like that's where this game falls short, if anywhere, is that you have particularly the latter half of the game where you're fighting symbiotes that can only be defeated one way with fire web, and it just becomes a bit tedious, and I end up, whenever I replay it now, you can literally just run past all the enemies and complete the game in a matter of hours, because it's quite frustrating, and that's where it's not as successful in translating. And there's there's a compromise there when you translate a game, and as much as you can compare this game to the Arkham series, I would also say that, and I'd love to know Chris Baker's perspective on this, having worked on it, but the Shattered Dimensions, I feel like, in a way, is the spiritual successor to this game, because it does away with the open world thing, and I think there's a compromise there. You either have the open world, or I think linearity in something like a Spider-Man game, you can better translate the kind of melodrama and soap opera elements of Spider-Man, which is what makes that character for me. Because I would compare something like Spider-Man 2 to, people say, the most important thing, the primary thing that they have to get right with Spider-Man PS4 is the web swinging. But when you open a Spider-Man comic, you don't just want to read panel after panel of Spider-Man swinging around New York. You want the melodrama. It's much more about the personal. And I think that's where this game, I'm now shifting into what it does right. That's what this game does really well. And in terms of, boss battles, one of the parts that I played through today, just to refresh my memory, was the Rhino boss battle. And a lot of the boss battles are, the puzzles, and it really puts you into that mindset of Spider-Man of seeing a problem, and Spider-Man isn't a brute, he's not a brawler as such. He has to approach a problem and he has to see how he can work it out, and I think that it does that really well. The Rhino one, where you've got to lure Rhino into either explosive barrels or the kind of electric generators, and there are, again, to wax lyrical about Arkham, there are elements of that in Arkham. I'm thinking of the Clayface battle in Arkham City, things like that feels, or even the Bane battle in Arkham.
And the Mr. Freeze fight too in City.
Absolutely, yeah, one of the best boss battles I can think of, really. And there's definite lineage there, and I think that also that pays respect to the character. That boss battle can only be conceived with Rhino if there is a fundamental understanding of the Rhino as a character. So I think that does, it's really successful in that respect. I also, going back to the voice actors, you said about Rino Romano, who I feel was kind of the last of the old guard of Spider-Man voice actors, in the same camp as Christopher Daniel Barnes. And I feel like after that point, from kind of Neil Patrick Harris onwards, and particularly with Josh Keaton, the character became more kind of teen orientated and kind of a bit more edgy, and to each their own. But that's less to my taste. So I really appreciate having, again, that contributes to it being a kind of a time capsule for Spider-Man. But then you also have Jennifer Hale returning from Spider-Man the Animated Series, and also Spider-Man Unlimited as Black Cat and Mary Jane. And then you have I'm going to get this name wrong, but Ephraim Zimbalist.
Ephraim Zimbalist, yes.
Yeah. So and we get the German Doc Ock that first debuted in the animated series. And then the last thing in terms of what it gets right, I could gush about this game for hours about what it gets right, but in terms of things, just one other thing is that the color of it. This is the most colorful, I think. There certainly hasn't been a Spider-Man game as colorful since this game, and it really does feel like it's the 4-color 60s comics brought to life, and particularly, what's so distinctive and what made those 60s Silver Age comics so successful is this interconnectivity between the world and this like long form storytelling, and this game could be the first 48 issues of the Lee and Ditko Spider-Man in terms of the villains and things like that. And you get references to the Green Goblin, you get a reference to Kraven the Hunter, and in terms of the color and everything, the interconnectivity, you get, right at the beginning of the game, you get the 4 Freedoms Plaza, you get the Punisher stuff, and you get Daredevil popping in. And I remember playing that at the time, and it appealed to the same part of me that comics appeal to, which is that, wow, this feels like I'm in this world. It was very, very immersive, much more so than something like Tomb Raider or another 3D action game equivalent, where those worlds are kind of generic. I'm not deriding those games at all, but
But you didn't have an emotional connection to those worlds like you would at something like Spider-Man.
Yeah, true. So anyway, the last thing in terms of, and I really feel like this is, something that's lasted from this game, is that, to my knowledge, the Tommy Tallarico, if that's how you pronounce his last name, the soundtrack, I think that this is kind of the first time, with the exception of the animated series, that you get that kind of industrial rock and techno kind of soundtrack to Spider-Man the character, and that, to this day, people associate that with the character. And you listen to something like the soundtrack to Ultimate Spider-Man, and it feels like that the music side of it. And for me, as my background is in music and in sound design, and so all that stuff, especially with comic book games, is so important, because you're taking a comic book medium, which where you're having to put those sounds into it in your head with written sound effects and things like that. And when it's like articulated in real sound, if it's done successfully, it can't be jarring to what you've imagined, is what I'm saying. And I really feel like the sound and the audio in this game, that might be something that goes overlooked, but it really ties that comic book version of Spider-Man together for me.
Yeah, no, that's very well said, and I totally agree with that. The thing that comes in my mind, at least, just about the opening theme and the end credits theme, it's almost like the 90s animated show and the original 67 cartoon theme had a baby, and like their baby was that, which I think is great. But Chris, kind of jumping on to a point that Josh was making there, as someone who has worked on games with this character, how much, if at all, do prior games like Spider-Man 2000 on something like Shattered Dimensions, how much does that stuff come into play?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment that Josh said, that it was kind of a spiritual successor to that. I mean, one of the kind of big internal questions we had when we decided to let, Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions move forward as it was like, people are really used to open world Spider-Man games now. Are they going to see this as a step back? Mm-hmm. And it's like, the argument for it was like, you can really tailor the levels to be like really reflect the character in his world and the story you want to tell and that sort of thing. You can do that better in a game like that, which, was very well demonstrated in the 2000 game. So, it certainly was no official sequel to it or anything, but I think it was certainly a reference point, and and I think the people who enjoyed Shattered Dimensions probably had fond memories of this 2000 game. And I think the people who did not, their big knock against it was that it had no open world. They were probably the types who were more interested in the mechanics that Spider-Man 2 brought along, more so than the character of Spider-Man and his world. There's definitely some connection between those. I did think of a wrong thing for this game that we have not talked about yet.
Oh, please.
And that is the fact that the webs do not attach to anything.
Yes.
So you can web swing into the sky, which, is something that was also brought back in later games like The Amazing Spider-Man. And it's just like a suspension of disbelief thing, or you can say there's a helicopter there all the time. So if you really want to get super nitpicky, like that's something you can do. But I would argue too that the fact that we really never had this swinging sensation in a game before, which, I think is what really made me love it from the start, because you do it almost right away. That more than makes up for just that suspension of disbelief. It's like, if you're going to complain about that, then you should complain about the fact that it takes 6 shots to kill somebody in Call of Duty or something.
Right. Yeah, sure.
And then that they can just sit behind behind something and heal,
right.
It's that kind of thing.
Well, and the swinging too in this game, you could not swing indefinitely, which I think balances it a little bit.
Right, yeah, I forgot about that. There's finite web fluid.
Well,
right?
it's 3 swings before you're grounded, so you'll do like one. How the levels are done, I feel it's like every building is spaced apart such that you can get there in about 2 to 3 swings, and at the third one, he just starts to go towards the ground or whatever surface you're on.
Yeah. And what was the thing that you thought of, Blair, that it got wrong?
Oh yeah, in the Mysterio fight, because you find out there's a doppelganger, and he has a dialogue with Mysterio, and then Mysterio says, "I've been wanting to shut that mouth up for decades," and I was like, okay, so yeah, decades in the comics, but he hasn't been Spider-Man for decades. He looks like he's in his 20s, so I guess maybe his 20s and his teens are 2 decades. Yeah, I never cared for that line of dialogue. It's always bothered me. And I just
the old floating the floating timeline is a perennial problem of comic book narrative fiction. I can't tell you how many times, especially, working as a retailer when the New 52 started, how many questions I got about, wait a second, they've only been heroes for 5 years, but how could Dick Grayson have been Robin and now he's Nightwing, and that was supposed to have been a long time? This stuff doesn't fit, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, just go.
I think it's literally impossible for a character like Batman or Spider-Man or someone who's had literally thousands of stories written about them to exist in one lifetime, much less like their 20s to 30s.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, not very.
So yeah, it's suspension of disbelief again.
Yep. Always.
Also, I would interpret that as is that not a fourth wall break? There's like a lot of fourth wall breaking like dialogue and things like that. There's
I would say that too.
Billboards for Wolverine and Captain America, and it's like, why would there be billboards for Wolverine?
Activision billboards in Times Square that showed up in some of those later games.
Yeah, there's also a Jeffrey Swinger billboard.
Isn't there a Visit Latveria, or am I thinking of a different Spider-Man game? There's a billboard that says Visit Latveria.
I do not remember that.
But it might have been
I remember there's a Jerry Springer style fonted ad in the police chase. I don't remember. Isn't there Tony Hawk? Isn't Tony Hawk 2 playing somewhere? And Spider-Man is technically in that game.
Yeah, that's in Jay Jonah's office. And then there's the Tony Hawk's billboard, and sorry, this is getting just really chatting about the.
No, that's all
you
right.
know,
It's funny.
But yeah, if you go past the billboard, Spider-Man will say, "Oh, Tony Hawk, I skated with that guy."
Oh, that's fun.
And-
Yeah, that's,
because he's a playable character in Tony Hawk 2, I believe.
yeah, yep. That's fun, and that is absolutely suspension of disbelief, fourth wall breaking, Easter egg kind of jokes, and I can roll.
Yeah,
with
the
those.
game just doesn't take itself that seriously as a whole.
Right?
So,
Yeah, true.
and that's good. That's fine.
Mm-hmm.
It's a video game about comic book characters.
Yeah, totally. Well, is there anything about the 2000 game that you guys feel might be missing from the Spider-Man games that would follow? Did it do something you would have liked to see more of in subsequent games, or did it do a pretty good job of capturing him considering both the source material and the technology of the time? Blair, what do you think about that?
I think going towards Chris's point and about Shattered Dimensions in this game is that I actually prefer the linear game Spider-Man games to the open world ones, because I feel that with the open world Spider-Man games, and again, I probably will be proven wrong on Friday, that so much emphasis is putting into the mechanics that everything else feels like an afterthought. Like as good as Spider-Man 2 is, for example, like every level where you're not swinging around to me is an absolute nightmare. Like I hate swinging to the Statue of Liberty. I hate being in that small enclosed theater in the Mysterio level. Like everything is just so frustrating when you're not doing just casually swinging around outside. And what I really like about this game, and I guess I don't want to really get into the sequel, which is they're almost like one giant game referring to Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. I really miss the set pieces. Because the open world games, again, it's mechanically excellent and so groundbreaking, but this one you have like the police chase, and then the section in the sewers and the mazes, and an Enter Electro. One of my favorite levels is there's a runaway plane that you have to stop with your webbing, and I really like those things that take advantage of Spider-Man's powers as opposed to just getting around. And that's what I really love about these games, and how focused the story allows it to be. Like Chris mentioned, like you can do so much more drama and tailor your levels to Spider-Man's abilities when you're not just having this big open world. So that's what I really miss, and that's what I felt in the latter Beanox games in Amazing Spider-Man 1 and less 2, that I think if they maybe got a third pass, they would have married the two, where they would have had open world and levels, but that didn't happen. But yeah, that's my favorite thing is the set pieces and how tailored they are, and how you can mix it up. Like the first level is there's no villains, but you get used to sneaking around and finding exits, and only Spider-Man can. Like you have grates on the ground, so you have to know to zip up to the ceiling and crawl through somewhere. And yeah, just in the later levels, like when you're in Doc Ock's base and you have to, on easy, there's a bridge that goes through the entire thing, but on normal and hard, you have to swing to these platforms and hit these lasers and avoid them. And I really miss stuff like that as it went into 2 and Ultimate, which they're still very good games, and I love Ultimate Spider-Man, but I definitely missed how varied and focused this game, and to a lesser extent its sequel, were.
Sure. Very understandable. Now, Chris, you have kind of a unique perspective on this since you worked on several of the following Spider-Man games. So, kind of in hindsight, was there anything that the 2000 game was able to do that you guys maybe weren't able to sort of implement in later games, or something you would have liked to see? And kind of as you and both Blair alluded to, with, having more focus in linear games, is that something you agree with?
Yeah, I think it certainly helps not just Spider-Man, but any like story-driven, character-focused game to have more, kind of scripted levels, I guess.
Sure.
But I don't think still don't think it's impossible to have an open world game that plays that way. It's just a lot more work, and I think Insomniac's probably gonna prove it out. That's my hunch. But yeah, in terms of things missing, I think between this game, I guess you could throw Inter Electro in there as well. Between Inter Electro and Shattered Dimensions, we did have Ultimate Spider-Man, which was very set in the Ultimate universe, and then we had a ton of movie games,
Right?
If you count up all the different iterations of movie games, it's on different consoles and handhelds and such, it's probably in the neighborhood of 15 to 20
There's
altogether.
4 each for Spider-Man 2 and 3. Not counting the N-Gage and the PC.
I thought it's more than 4 for Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man 2
has just counting dedicated consoles. I know there's the console and the PC and the Game Boy and the DS and the PSP and the N-Gage.
And you run through all of those in the Spider Madness panel, which is definitely something people should check out if they haven't already.
But just the fact that it was a very pure comic based experience, I think, is something that the games, I don't want to push aside Ultimate, because that's in some ways the next evolution of what this was, I think. Sure. Because it did have an open world. That's a whole other topic, but I definitely want to give props to Ultimate. It's a great game, but in terms of the traditional 616, if you want to call it that, Spider-Man, even though this did feel more animated series in some ways, there was a huge gap between these 2 PS1 games, and then Shattered Dimensions would really be the next time. I think in that sense something was missed. The old school comic bookness of it all. The Ultimate brought some great new school comic bookness in there. And even the movie games, like I said, in the 2002 game, they modeled their villains after the early villains that Spider-Man fought in the comics. So there was certainly a comic inspiration.
Sure, yeah.
But it's still, Green Goblin still looks like a Power Ranger villain, right? Nothing against Green Goblin in that movie. I love that movie.
Yeah,
it's great.
Of course.
But yeah, in terms of the stuff I worked on, I think we just wanted to do Spider-Man as right as we could, given what we had to work with in a certain way. You had Shattered Dimensions was super comic booky, not just the Amazing Spider-Man as this would be, but Ultimate and Noir in 2099 as well. Edge of Time had a shorter production schedule, but I think it actually there's a huge plot hole in it, but I think it actually at the end of the day had a better story in terms of being a story-based experience. Then you get to the Amazing movie games, and we had to live in the Amazing movie game world,
right?
But we also tried to apply the comic bookness as much as we could, that it would fit within this kind of different take that Mark Webb's vision was. So yeah, I don't know if anything was missing necessarily. I would say more so that the kind of spirit that went into this game is very indicative of the kind of spirit that went into the games that I worked on.
Yeah, no, excellent, great perspective. Josh, what do you think? Do you think that there's anything missing in subsequent games that the 2000 game had, or do you have a different take?
No, I agree, particularly with Blair. I think he touched on a lot of the stuff that I wanted to say, especially about set pieces. And I too, the thing I'm most excited about with the release of Insomniac Spider-Man on Friday is to see how well they've got that marriage between linearity and storytelling and the open world. And from what we've seen, the most recent kind of big footage we got was the Electro battle at the raft, and and that was a set piece. That was a big, huge set piece,
Right.
and a lot of that actually, reminded me of the ending of the sequel to Neversoft Spider-Man: Enter Electro, and the games in the interim between now and then, I feel like there has always had to be some compromise there, particularly on the movie license things, because you can't fit in every aspect of the character. And to me, the Neversoft Spider-Man is kind of it's so appropriate for the time, because it really neatly is that snapshot of what Spider-Man is at that point and what they can do with the hardware, and it's the most neat kind of distillation of the character for me. And everything since then has kind of had some kind of baggage or something missing, and that's why it is my favorite. And as excited as I am for Friday, I'm not overly optimistic that it will knock it off as my favorite, as great as I'm sure it'll be. Another point, it just occurred to me when Chris was talking about the about Shattered Dimensions as a spiritual sequel is the Stan Lee narration, which that just contributes to this idea that when playing Spider-Man 2 or even Ultimate or anything since, I'm swinging around in New York that doesn't feel like the Marvel New York to me. It feels like New York, but it doesn't. It doesn't feel like the Marvel New York, and these are superficial things. But seeing that the Sanctum Sanctorum and the Avengers Tower are in Insomniac Spider-Man, that is really exciting to me, because that feels like that'll be the first time since the 2000 game that it feels like there is a larger universe at play here, and just things like the all the costumes. This was the first game to have unlockable costumes, as far as I'm aware, and the collectible comics and things like that. That's become such a key component of Spider-Man games and superhero games in general since then, and that in itself, in an open world game, that can become bloated, and I think of Web of Shadows. There was like 500 collectible spiders that didn't mean anything, and I, like an idiot, collected every single one. But it's about neatness to me, and this game is the pinnacle of that really tidy representation of the character without any messiness. If that makes sense.
Can I just jump in and say that I totally forgot about Web of Shadows for some reason?
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt, but I was thinking
that was definitely a comic. That was definitely a comic book game too, and it was a pleasure. It was my first Spider-Man game I got to work on, and I feel rather foolish for saying that that there was that huge gap, but it was still a very movie kind of world at that point, anyway.
Oh, sure.
And I do think there was, in that game, there was a lot of like general Marvel Universe representation. You met up with Luke Cage and Moon Knight, and Stark Tower was there, and it's like
it had the Void up top too, didn't it?
Yeah. The way it looked in New Avengers, you had Black Widow. That was a super that was super involved. There was even a scene where he's like, he's trying to call like the Fantastic Four, and they're out of town, and the Avengers are in another universe or something. It accounts for like why aren't all these other big name superheroes?
There's a boss battle with
pitching
Wolverine that tests your Marvel trivia.
That's right.
Yeah, I wrote that.
Awesome. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's either awesome or terrible, depending on who you ask.
I'm going with awesome.
Yeah, I'm not going to take full credit. Just to set the record straight, I don't want to take full credit for that scene existing, but I did write the questions.
Awesome.
That are asked. Yeah.
Like I said, it's my podcast. I say awesome. So.
Yeah.
All right. Well, gentlemen, this has been a great conversation. I got one final question for you. And you guys have kind of alluded to this over the course of the whole discussion, but I don't think there's anything wrong with just making a kind of final declarative statement to close things out. So if you had to quantify the position of this game, both in your own mind and also in the sort of canonized legacy of Spider-Man gaming, at least before the release of the Insomniac game, which we're recording a few days before it comes out. Where do you think it sits? Josh, I think I know what you're going to say personally, but please take it away.
Well, I mean, to me, I do go back and forth between this and Ultimate Spider-Man because, again, I feel like that is, as I was just saying, it, that had a very clear vision of what it wanted to do and what it wanted to represent, and I feel like it was very successful in that. But ultimately, I like these retro games, and these are the things that I go back to because they're the version of Spider-Man that I love. I don't, everything that's come since, I've not been so active in reading and things like that. So this game, it feels the same as the animated series to me, the 90s animated series. It's my Spider-Man. Right. That sounds, kind of dweeby, but it is. So yeah, it would have to be number one to me. In terms of, where it sits in the legacy, I think objectively, in terms of in terms of influence, certainly, and, what has turned out to define what a superhero game is, and particularly a Spider-Man game, Spider-Man 2 is kind of objectively, quote unquote, the better game. But really, going back to this, I said at the beginning of the conversation, but Spider-Man 2000 is the Sergeant Pepper, it's the Arkham Asylum, it's the Jaws, it's whatever you want to say. It was the watershed moment for superhero games. There's no getting around that, really. So that's where it stands for me in terms of legacy.
Blair, how about you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It always hovers around the top for it's. I'll throw out a dark horse, and I'm probably one of the few people who put the Amazing Spider-Man on Game Boy up towards the top because that's just personal because that was the first ever Spider-Man and superhero game I ever owned. But there's a big piece in US Gamer that everyone should read by Alex Kane. It's the oral history of Spider-Man 2, and you see how much of the DNA from this game made it into that game. And the first movie game, they admit a lot of it had to do with refining the mechanics from this game. And I believe it was revealed, I don't know if it was ever stated, that that project started out as a PlayStation 2. I don't know if it was going to be a port or an upgrade to this title. But you wouldn't have Spider-Man 2 without this game. For this, it hovers around the top between this Ultimate, Maximum Carnage, and Shattered Dimensions. I almost said Separation Anxiety. But even there might be some games I like better, but this game is just so much more infinitely replayable. A couple of months ago, I had this on the Dreamcast exclusively, as I'm a huge Dreamcast fan, and this is one of this Dreamcast version is the best for a few reasons. Namely, the visuals and the webs on Spider-Man's costume are important to me, and the mask on Black Cat's face. But I bought it on the PlayStation so I can just play it in my PlayStation 3 and just throw it in there. And it's you don't have to make a big commitment for this. Like, I feel if you start a lot of Spider-Man games, it's something that's going to take a while. But for this, you just throw it in, put it on easy, and you can go through the entire thing, whether you watch the cutscenes or not. And it's still enjoyable to do, and it's something I do all the time. Like I said, I did last week because I just bought the N64 game because I said, well, I own the other two, I might as well own the third one. I don't own the PC game. I guess that's next on the list, and the Kellogg's exclusive demo thing. But yeah, as much as I might love something, or the refinements of something like Ultimate Spider-Man, I know when I start that game, it's a commitment to see it to the end or to get to some of the better parts. But with this, you can consume it all in an hour, and it's a great hour. And that was I feel was a knock against it. At least that's what a lot of my friends said back in high school, is they said it was too short. And yeah, it is a short game, but it's also something that you can replay on higher difficulties, whether you're searching for comics or just there's a few mini games you can do. There's just so much in there that it's just impossible not to love, and how important it was. You think of the 2000s when it was the X-Men movie and Spider-Man, and yes, there was Blade. You can't discount that, but Spider-Man, the X-Men were the ones that really kicked things into high gear in that year, as Joss brought up. I got Mutant Academy coming off of X-Men hype, and I love Mutant Academy. And then you had this, and then suddenly it was okay to be excited for a comic book game, which was something for the majority of the PlayStation, even a lot of the Super Nintendo 16-bit era, you were still a bit trepidatious about. But yeah, it's just a great game, and it's so I just sigh a little because when I think about discoverability of a game like this and how licensing means it will never get remade or re-released easily. So I just hope if anyone really wants to try it, I mean, get the PlayStation version, get it on a PlayStation 3. It's still looks okay. The controller is great. So yeah, it's don't kind of forget this or go back and play it for the first time, I guess.
I actually have Blair mentioned the Kellogg's exclusive version, which I don't know if you talked about in your show, Chris, but there was a in 2002 there was a giveaway on Kellogg's cereals. I don't remember which exactly, but it was the PC version of this game through the Rhino fight, I believe. The only difference was that he was wearing the movie costume. So, and that was just a free giveaway, and you can buy it pretty cheap off of eBay. I got one for like $4 or something.
Oh, wow.
And then I put it in my modern PC, expecting it to have like an error, like most games of that era do, and it worked. It worked perfectly.
Oh, awesome.
So that would lead me to believe that the PC version probably works as well. Don't quote me on that if it doesn't work on your PC, but I think that might even be the easiest way and maybe even the cheapest way to get it.
Probably with actually I played the PC version not too long ago, just the regular retail release, and it worked fine. It seemed like it had some of the enhancements that I attribute to the Dreamcast version, and it had a much higher frame rate. But even though some of the animations are animated at 30, but the actual gameplay is 60, so seems to run okay. And if that's the way that you want to do it, yeah, I echo those sentiments exactly, because it's not an expensive game to find for PC by any stretch of the imagination.
It's pretty expensive on the other consoles, though.
Is it?
It's yeah, it's, I don't know, it's probably in the 20s, I think, on PlayStation. Then I've been looking at Dreamcast because I recently got my first Dreamcast.
Oh, cool.
And I'd like to have it on that, but it's like $45. So it's like, yeah, I go to these retro gaming conventions, and that's about the running price for it on Dreamcast. So I don't know what PC is going for exactly, but probably not that much because PC games in general are cheaper.
Right.
So I think that's probably, if you're looking to get it, your most cost-effective way to do it.
Well, Chris, if you had to quantify this game in your own mind and in the larger legacy of Spider-Man gaming, could you do it? Where would you put it?
I hate this question, but because it's like there's so many different things that you consider when it's like, is it the best, or is it the most influential, or like when you rank things or whatever. Because I do think the argument could be made it is the most influential, because it did influence Spider-Man 2, which I think would be the biggest one to compete with it in terms of influence. And just, nostalgically speaking, I think for me, it came at a very good time when I was very hungry for a good comic book game, because we hadn't seen one in a very long time. So for those reasons, it's definitely near the top, if not the top. My other personal favorite is probably Shattered Dimensions, largely because I worked on it and it was very much in the vein of this game. So, that's like the personal skew on this. The more objective skew is that, Spider-Man 2 is just far and away the favorite game of the general gaming public. I think that the more into Spider-Man you get, and the I don't know if I want to say the older you are, but if you're closer to my age, maybe you appreciate more kind of comic booky stuff. But like this game and I think Ultimate definitely are and Shattered are the ones that are really great for people wanting like a good Spider-Man story or Spider-Man universe. Web of Shadows is up there too. I think there's like little bits of greatness in pretty much every game since this game. Sure. And if Insomniac is like taking the bits of greatness that maybe the other games kind of slacked on here and there, then they easily have the best Spider-Man game ever, outside of like what's obviously the biggest budget of a Spider-Man game. Yeah. So that's very rambly, but I hope it answered your question in some way.
No, I think it did.
Actually, I do have a kind of fun story if we're winding down here now.
Yes.
So yeah, back in my official PlayStation days, actually Josh's mention of X-Men Mutant Academy sparked this memory in my mind. I did the cover story for X-Men Mutant Academy. It was the X-Men movie game, essentially. It came out about that time, and that was like a very hyped movie. So I did that cover story. I was like 3 months into my job at OPM at the time, so still pretty green. And I had the opportunity to interview Stan Lee. Phone interview, but it's an interview with Stan Lee. Awesome. I remember basically the night before not being able to sleep because I was so excited. And then, the time came, I interviewed him. It went great. It was awesome. And there was a point where it was kind of an initiative of a magazine at the time to try to get celebrities to like write columns for us. So I actually asked him if he'd be interested in writing a column for us. And he was like, yeah, I'm old and I don't really know video games, but sure, why not? So he actually did 2 for us. But, in kind of the course of that, I speaking to the fact that he didn't know much about video games, I was like, I'm going to take it upon myself to educate Stan Lee on Marvel video games right now. So I made a videotape, because that's all I could really make at the time in 2000. I made a VHS tape of, I think it was every PlayStation Marvel game. So I made like clips from, that Incredible Hulk game, Fantastic Four game, all these like really bad. Well, Marvel vs. Capcom was in there. Some decent stuff too, but most of it was pretty bad. And at the time, this was spring of 2000. At the time, I had a preview build of Spider-Man because it was still months from being released. So I threw that on there too, and I made like a point by point, like at 1 minute and 6 seconds, he's making a web dome, just so he could follow it and understand what's happening. So I made this tape. There's probably 10 minutes of Spider-Man footage on there, another 10 minutes of other stuff. And like 2 weeks later, he calls me.
Oh.
So Stan Lee calls me and he's like, Chris, I just wanted to let you know that I just got this videotape and I'm a big fan of yours now. I know you put a lot of work into this and I really appreciate it. And I was like, you're a fan of me? That's crazy. But, I was obviously very flattered, and he was like, yeah, and he made he wrote a couple columns for us from there. So there was a very brief stint of time where I was in fairly regular communication with Stan Lee. We sent a couple emails back and forth. Just me directly with Stan Lee. It's kind of
That's
surreal.
I can't
awesome.
wait to read your
Wow.
memoir
Yeah.
someday.
Oh, yeah, no kidding. Wow.
Well, actually, 7 years later, was it 7 years? Yeah, 7 years later, when I started at Marvel in late 2007, he was there on the Spike TV Video Game Awards to announce the Iron Man game. So I got to be in his car that they picked him up from the airport on, and I knew I was going to be there, so I brought one of my several copies of that issue, and I had him autograph it, and it's framed on my wall.
That's
right now.
spectacular.
It says the good old Chris Stanley. I remember he said, I'll even put my last name here, because I guess he just signs a lot of stuff with Stan.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. Well, I'm kind of surprised that you haven't
Yeah,
done something to
I'm
that
doing the
effect
same
on your
thing.
channel. You're gonna have to.
At some point,
Yeah. Well, that's
I did a Mark Hamill thing
yeah.
that's similar.
That was
Quick
great too. I mean, really, if anybody hasn't checked out your YouTube channel, then you really should, or Josh's for that matter. But speaking of which, that's a great note to go out on. So, gentlemen, thank you for all taking the time out to talk about Spider-Man 2000. I really appreciate it. I think this has been a lot of fun. It's been really informative too, which is always what I like to go for with Comics on Consoles. So, where can people find you online, and what do they have to look forward from you in the near future? Josh, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me on. I was a big fan before I ever got talked to you. I was a big fan of the show, and it's the fact that you do go so deep on these games and make them informative and get so much behind the scenes thing. Sorry, I'm
well,
just
thank you, man.
Singing your praises for a second, but yeah, it's it's really unique because a lot of people who are covering these games, myself included to some extent, they're looking at the surface details, but the fact that you are able to be so informed in these things is really admirable and fascinating.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do. Thank you very much.
But in terms of where you can find me, you can find me youtube.com/panels to pixels. That's the best place to find me and see my videos. You can also follow me on Twitter at panels to pixels. And in terms of stuff coming up that you can look forward to, for the past 2 months, I've been thinking about. I've been living and breathing Spider-Man, the animated series, the 1994 series. And I have trawled through the internet, through archives of old magazines, and I've watched every episode, and it's all leading up to what I believe is the most comprehensive history of Spider-Man, the animated series, ever committed to film. So I have no idea how long that's going to be at the minute. I think the draft I've got is about 2 hours long. So,
Wow.
but that should be a fascinating watch. I'll definitely be able to edit it down. It'll be more palatable than that. But also with Spider-Man coming out on Friday, things are going to get busy, and I've got a lot of stuff coming basically, and a lot of surprises that I can't really talk about yet. But yeah, I'll have a review of Spider-Man coming next week, hopefully, and things are going to ramp up. I've been a bit quiet, but things are going to be ramping up next month. Excellent.
Sounds like there's a lot to look forward to there. Blair, where can people find you, and what do people have to look forward to from you? And why don't you tell us a little bit about your book?
You can find my work at comicgamersassemble.com. I've been taking a somewhat of a hiatus throughout this year because I'm working on a book which will be titled The Web of Spider-Man Games, The Amazing and the Not So Spectacular. It touches on most every Spider-Man game ranging from the year 1990 up until previously it was going to be The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but I guess I can probably announce that there's probably going to be a Insomniac Spider-Man chapter in there now because the game is coming out next week and I have a bit of a vacation from my job in 2 weeks time. So look forward to that. I'm going through some editing process right now and I have to do some image sizing. And I guess if you want to find out when that will come out, you can follow me on Twitter at Blarcade. It's an arcade just with a BL in front, and you can also check out the Comics Gamers Assemble Facebook page. That's where you'll see I post a lot of news and videos about comic book games, including the work of these fine gentlemen that I'm with. And like Josh, I just want to say how great it is to be in the presence of everyone here. It's very humbling to be among such great people. Chris has his great stories. I remember mine. It's such a minor thing. As everyone finds out about finding one another, whether through the shows or online, I went to go see a movie called Nightcrawler. It's not based on the X-Men. It was a Jake Gyllenhaal movie, and I went by myself, and I was checking my Twitter feed, and I saw that this guy, Chris Baker, had followed me, and I was like, oh, well, who is this guy? And then I looked up, and I think I ran home after the movie, and I was like, holy crap, this guy who's worked on all these things is following me. Like, this is crazy. But yeah, yeah, it's great to be here. It was a lot of fun. I never miss an opportunity.
I was probably writing about Nightcrawler at that point, so there's the.
I think your book came out not too long after that.
Well, I mean, I discovered your channel working on that book.
Yeah, I guess we do a lot of Google searches for most superhero games. I'll probably
your website. I mean, I think I'm used to saying channel now.
You Google most superhero games. I'll either be on page 1 or page 2. Yeah, I haven't produced a lot this year. I did produce a article a week or two ago about how Insomniac Games' previous history is influenced what they're probably going to do with this upcoming Spider-Man game. So check that out. But yeah, other than that, just find me on Facebook, check my Twitter for any updates I have on my book, and I'll share them when they become available.
Excellent. Well, you absolutely deserve to be with us here because this is a great Spider-Man discussion. I've really enjoyed having you be a part of it, and I'm really glad that you were the one that was able to bring us all together. So thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Much appreciated.
It's entirely possible, Blair, that you have written more stuff about superhero video games than anybody else in the world. It's very possible.
Yeah, maybe I should.
I'm probably right behind you, but it's very possible.
I should talk to Guinness. They didn't take on the biggest superhero video game collection.
Hey, there you go. There you go. Excellent. Well, Mr. Baker, where can people find you, and what do people have to look forward from you in the near future?
Yeah, the easiest place to find me is at cbake76 on Twitter. And if you go there, you can find links to all the things. But Superhero.VG, as in superhero video games, is my YouTube channel. And there's a growing library of content there that I just kind of make stuff happen when I can. It's a hobby for me. It's not a job, so I can just make videos whenever I have the time and inclination. Right now, there's tons of stuff that I'd like to do. Who knows if I'll get around to do it. There's something I'd like to do with the Venom movie coming out. There's stuff I'd like to do just in general. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be more stuff about the video game, the new Insomniac game. That is a very huge part of the reason people go to my channel. Sadly, it's not for my Death and Return of Superman videos as much as I'd like people to watch those. But yeah, so I've been working on the sequel to my book for quite a while. It's probably going to be 2019 sometime at this point. And I am very busy right now working with Zen Studios on a project that has not been announced. It has nothing to do with superheroes or pinball or anything like that. But Zen Studios is one of my favorite video game developers of all time, and I'm very privileged to be very closely associated with them now. So yeah, there's just a lot of little things going on. So check out my Twitter, I guess, is the best, quickest way to summarize that.
Awesome. Well, again, guys, thank you for taking the time out to join me on this discussion. It's been a lot of fun talking about a great game, of course, and it's always great to be in the presence and to talk with such clear fans of both the video game medium and of the Spider-Man character and Marvel at large. So again, thank you guys, and we will dismiss it from here. That's going to do it for Comics on Consoles issue number 11.1, the discussion pertaining to Neversoft's Spider-Man from the year 2000. I hope you enjoyed listening to that as much as we enjoyed talking about it, and again, a very special thanks to my guests Chris Baker, Josh Sutton, and Blair Farrell for joining me so we could gush about one of the webhead's most defining video game experiences. Hopefully you came right into this after listening to issue number 11, where I explore in depth all of the factors that would lead to Spider-Man 2000 being such a standout experience in the character's interactive history. If not, go listen to it right now. It was released right alongside the discussion you just heard, and should be pretty easy to find wherever you came upon this issue of the podcast. Just in case you may have missed it, be sure to come back to us next year, as Comics on Consoles issue number 12 examines one of my all-time favorite 16-bit era comic book video games, The Death and Return of Superman, developed by Blizzard Entertainment and published by Sunsoft in 1994. In the meantime, feel free to follow Comics on Consoles on Facebook and Twitter, check out our website, comicsonconsoles.com, and subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting app of choice. Comics on Consoles is a proud member of the Batman Podcast Network. Until next time, keep saving the world, gamers and comics fans. After all, now more than ever, the world needs people who continue to believe in heroes. So, why not play one in a video game? Thanks again for listening, take care, and we will talk with you again soon.